Good morning, everyone. Well, I guess the typical good morning, good evening, good night sort of thing. I always found it funny when people would say that, and I get it because a lot of you might be joining from a variety of different places, but pretty early for me. And just a little quick thing before we get started, I figured I'd share. I have a little office buddy who's joining me more frequently today. So for those of you watching live, you'll see my Sunny Cam here as he hangs out on my desk. His name is Sunny. We call him Sunny Bear, and he's just a cutie and he wants attention. That's all he wants. So anyway, welcome to this week's live stream. I'm super excited. Glad we're back now after the holidays. We all had a bit of a break, depending on where you're in the world, different holidays, different time off, all that type of stuff. But a lot going on here at Orkes and a lot going on with Conductor. And so as we get closer to the end of January, where some cool stuff hopefully is going to be announced, and then rolling into the rest of, calendar Q1, we wanted to get kind of our first big live stream off the ground and bring Haven back and talk a bit about, various common use cases you can see with Conductor, and they generally apply, I think in most cases apply to both open source and Orkes Conductor. But before we get into that, and before I bring Haven on, I wanted to just say thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm going to throw this up on the screen real quick. A little call to action. If you want to follow along at all while we're doing this stream today or afterward, if you want to try out Conductor at any time, you can go to our developer playground. So if you go to orkes.io, you'll see a button there saying try for free. Click there. It takes you to this really cool sandbox environment that we have that's got your own namespace. You can play around with it. Or if you're watching on whatever platform right now, just pull up your mobile device and scan the QR code I've got on the screen. It'll take you right to the same place. You can sign up for free and use it as much as you want. And especially with today's show and some of the things we'll talk about, you are more than welcome to pull that up and sort of follow along as Haven's showing stuff and we're talking about really cool options for you. So wanted to share that. All right, that is enough of me just blabbing. I'm going to bring on, we'll do one more little quick touch base. There's Sunny. He's happy. All right, I'm going to bring on our guest, Haven King. Haven, how are you doing?
Hello. Doing well. It's a beautiful morning here in Seattle. I learned yesterday, actually, that we're gaining 1 minute of daylight every day, and I'm feeling that.
Dude, fantastic. I know it's like we haven't had any rain in probably a week or two here in the Sacramento, California area, but it's probably about 40 degrees every morning when we get up, but it is bright and sunny, which is kind of nice. So how's the snow and rain been for y'all in the Pacific Northwest recently?
Surprisingly dry in Seattle itself. I'm a snowboarder, so I've been going out to the mountains, and the snow's been fairly nice. But yeah, I'm looking around, and there are no puddles on the ground at my house, at least. So
that's good, dude. That is a good sign for sure, especially with a lot of the older homes in that area. They tend to to do that a few times. Cool, man. Well, I'm going to pull up my notes real quick. But before we get started, you mind giving everyone a quick introduction of who you are, what you do, I don't know, stuff like that?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Haven. I am an architect/engineer here at Orkes, so I work with a lot of our customers to do things like get them set up, teach them how to use the product, do performance testing, that kind of thing. I'm also on the engineering team, so I'm doing a lot of work on our API orchestration functionality and improving performance there. Day-to-day, working with customers, writing code, I do a little bit of it all.
That's cool, dude. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. I was just checking real quick, and it looks like I'm not sure if the LinkedIn Live is actually working properly. I apologize for anyone who tried to join there. It's our first time trying to get that going. So if it's not working for you on LinkedIn, I apologize. I did put the event listed there, but hopefully we can get everyone from LinkedIn over here to watch it on YouTube with us. But no big deal. I'll worry about that. As producer here, I'll worry about that off to the side. Doing that while we have a cool conversation. So to kind of get started for the morning, what I wanted to jump into is, and Haven, you probably can give everyone a much better understanding or description of this, but Conductor at base, Orkes Conductor in specific, but Conductor at base is, as a workflow orchestration tool, like its counterparts in the world, it's really good at making it a lot easier and more efficient, and probably other adjectives in there too, for building your applications, deploying them, running them successfully, monitoring them, like all kinds of other things we can do. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today in that sort of top 5 idea are really common use cases, or common things that these types of platforms are really good at helping you with to simplify building out your apps and deploying them and all that jazz. So if you wouldn't mind, for anybody who hasn't played around with Conductor a whole lot or is just starting to dabble in it, would you mind giving everyone kind of like the 30-second pitch on like what is a workflow orchestration platform, and then specifically how does Conductor approach doing that?
Sure. Yeah. So, what is a workflow orchestration platform? What does it offer you? A lot of the time, what I'll talk about in my first 10, 15 seconds, depending on who I'm talking to, it's a state machine, right? You have a particular kind of state that your company needs to observe, that you need to work on within your application, and Conductor will track that for you. Now, you're still going to write code, right? Your workflow is only the process. You still need the actual actions, the actual things that get performed. But the workflow will then take off the heavy lifting of handling when the particular actions take place. Lots of benefits from that, lots of benefits that are like tangential to that. So I know you mentioned like monitoring and alerting and that kind of thing. That's not really related to your core workflow, but it is a great functionality that you get out of most workflow orchestrators, most orchestrators in general, just because we're already observing state, and we can go ahead and kick off processes based on that. That's kind of like very quick 30-second overview of like what it means to use a workflow orchestrator. Obviously, there's a bunch of other nuance to it, but that's where I'll start off.
Cool. Thank you for that. And I appreciate it. And I know I mentioned a lot of those other components that to your point aren't like a piece of the workflow platform itself, but they do. I've got to imagine that they do, in using a platform like Conductor does enable monitoring the flow of your application, how it's working, and all that type of stuff from a functional perspective. I don't mean necessarily the more user interface style or the user experience style of things, but more of the, is it working? Are the functions you are orchestrating, you're planning to have happen, are they executing the way they're supposed to? I have to imagine that it does make those, like watching those things and understanding when failures happen, or stuff like that occurs, that it's probably easier to do than just simply building it from scratch and not using a tool like Conductor.
Yeah, and it absolutely is. One of the examples I'll give fairly early on when we start talking about monitoring and observability of like where there is a breakdown in that functionality is we don't have either in enterprise or in open source like a built-in email connector, right? If you want to send an email with Orkes Conductor or with open source Conductor, whichever, you need to have some way of sending an email. Orkes Conductor in general is going to be really great at deciding when to send an email, right? We've got a lot of functionality for like, okay, if a workflow fails, notify somebody via some mechanism. Again, you're responsible for that mechanism, but we're able to act on that and actually dispatch a notification to whatever that might be. And then on the other side, that's the monitoring, that's the alerting. The observability side, yeah, Orkes Conductor gives you a great visual of your workflows as they're in progress to see what the process looks like. Open source Conductor actually does do that as well. Some other workflow orchestration platforms out there don't necessarily offer visualization, but it is a common feature. So that's going to be, again, part and parcel. Because we know what the state is of a workflow at any given time, we can show you what the entire expected process was going to be, including failures, right?
Yeah, that makes total sense. So if you're running like Grafana or something, or some other tool like that, you can, and I know we do that internally with Grafana and Prometheus, is to, but it could be really anything you want to use. We set that up to basically monitor a lot of those very specific either failure points or common failure points or other flow based, hey, did this complete successfully, etc. So we can watch and see how often are our product workflows completing the way they're supposed to. Are they having issues? Things like that, which is kind of interesting because one, you need to do it as as a product company. You need to be able to monitor it. Is your thing actually working for your customers? But also, I think it's very helpful for people who are deploying Conductor, whether it's the open source or they're doing a hosted Orkes version, to be able to monitor that so they have really good insight. Because as much as any of us who have been engineers at any point in our career, whether it's software or networking or what have you, like we want it to just be mean time to resolution and just have everyone think about it that way. But unfortunately, often it's the mean time to innocence, and like, no, it's not me. my favorite tagline in the past when I worked at Cisco and other places and did networking things was always like, it's not the network. So it was always like, as much as we didn't want it to be the mean time to innocence, unfortunately, that's how sometimes it gets approached by business counterparts. That's a whole separate conversation. Nothing bad there. It's just, I think there's a lot of communication things that could happen a little bit better. But back to the workflow side, the idea of monitoring and stuff like that, I think makes it just so much easier. And it kind of leads into the first topic I wanted to get to with you. Where are my notes? Sorry, did not have them up on the screen. Is this idea, and I think you're the one who actually said this phrase or something very similar to me just after I started at Orkes. You and I were talking one day, kind of just meeting, and you mentioned the phrase, I think it was glue code, and it stuck with me because I like stuff like that. Like, I can hear the tagline or the technical documentation, but when I hear something like, it helps save you time on building glue code, I'm like, ooh, what's glue code? Like, I think glue for my 3D printer or something else. Like, it kind of sticks in your brain. So I thought the first thing to get, the first of the top 5 that might be really useful to talk about when it comes to Conductor in general is the ability for it to sort of make it easier to build your workflow by reducing the need to create glue code. So what does that mean? Like, what exactly does it mean to like reduce glue code? Because I've built a few workflows myself where I've done something up and I've built it out and I've seen it and I can see how some things are easier, but I'm not an app developer. So I think it'd be interesting to talk about what we mean by glue code and like how that actually fits in and how does it help?
Yeah, great question. I think when I talk about glue code, I think the easiest way to convey what we mean by glue code is honestly just like giving examples, right? Examples of functionality that Orkes and Conductor offer out of the box that if you were to try to do those similar functionality in your application, you would have to write the code to do so, right? And so that's going to be pretty baseline execution functionality, things like task retries, right? If we were to picture an application and your application needs to make a series of API calls. Also, sorry, Jeff, am I in sharing mode? Is that
Oh,
people see
yes.
my
Sorry,
screen?
I apologize. I'm not on it. Guest share. There you are. Now you are. Everyone can
Perfect.
see your stuff.
Awesome. And this is just going to be Orkes Conductor. I'll be kind of like walking through as I talk what this workflow is going to be looking like and what you might build or how you might build this out as a standalone service, standalone application, right? But essentially, we have an empty workflow, an empty process that needs to be done. If you were writing this in a programming language, Java, Python, whatever, and you needed to build and deploy this application, you 100% could write something that does the exact same thing functionally as what I'll be building out here. But you would have a lot more glue code in the middle. So what does that mean? Well, my service is going to do 3 things. And for each of these things, I'm going to call some external API. What this API actually is for now doesn't matter. But just imagine that these are 3 different service calls to 3 different APIs, right? At the end of the day, this is very easy. I did that in 3 seconds. Now, again, this is the visual editor. We have SDKs. You could build this using your programming language if you wanted to in a similar amount of time. But essentially, we have 3 API calls that we're making to some various platforms. Now, if I were to write this in a programming language natively without worrying about a workflow orchestrator, I would probably need to have some kind of behavior in here to catch exceptions and to potentially retry API calls if an API call fails. Maybe I want to do that a specific number of times. Maybe I want to do that and to have a back off interval such that if it fails, well, I'll try again in 5 seconds, and that's okay. 5 seconds is an acceptable window for my particular application, right? But those are all things I would have to write code for. And if you're writing this code in a service, you're writing this in an application, you have to think of a bunch of different other implications that come in. So things like thread. Make sure that if you're handling a large number of requests, you're not going and just sleeping a system thread for those 5 seconds between the time when you fail and when you retry, right? Of course, all programming languages have ways of dealing with concurrency, but it's just more code that you have to write, more things you have to think about versus using an orchestrator, whether it's Conductor or something else out there. It takes a lot of that heavy lifting off of you, right? I use the retry example here because I think it makes a lot of sense to a lot of people very quickly. But things like the monitoring and observability behaviors that Conductor offers, That's going to be a good example. Things like high parallelization of workflows, so doing a lot of things at the same time. Those are things that are very easy to do with an orchestration platform in general, right? And so those are the kinds of applications where, yes, you 100% can do it in your native language code, but is that going to be the best approach? Is that going to get you to production fastest? Oftentimes, those are the problems that we look to solve with Conductor.
Awesome. Let me bring my video up there so it's not too confusing. So, okay, so that's, I mean, not to sound like I'm the silly dummy like pandering to you here. I apologize if that sounds a little too on the nose, but okay, so that makes a lot of sense. The idea being that you're minimizing the need for somebody to build all those additional tools to do the retries or handle exceptions and things like that. It's already built into the workflow platform. So all you really have to worry about is, or concern yourself with, is I list out the things that need to happen, and the platform is going to, and then I tell the platform, here's how I want you to handle retries, etc. You just give it some basic information about that, and it will take care of executing that for you. How detailed can you get with that? Like, I'm assuming it's not just a matter of like superficial, just retry. Okay, cool, we're done. Can you do things like invoke webhooks, call a different workflow that could do something different? Like, how flexible can that sort of like retry handling or timeout type handling be in Conductor?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were a couple of different questions you just touched on there. I guess first I'll take them in backwards order of what you mentioned them. First, with how configurable is the retry behavior? Retry behavior for these tasks in particular, if you're using our like built-in concept of retrying a task, can get fairly granular. You can do, for example, if we look under the retry settings header, you can say retry 3 additional times. So if an API call fails, try it 3 additional times at 60-second intervals or at 3-second intervals. And you can have that interval change over time. So it could maybe get slightly larger. You can say, every time 1.5 times that retry interval, or double that retry interval. So 3 seconds, then 6 seconds, then 9 seconds, right? For however many retries you have configured. That's an example of like the level of granularity for retry settings at this level, but you can always build that functionality out additionally into your workflow and still have it handled for you. We have several mechanisms for doing things multiple times, right? So if you wanted to, this probably is a familiar concept to anyone who has programming experience, you can go ahead and run a do while loop, right? And similarly, if we're talking just API calls and you're just trying to make this API call until a certain condition is met, we do also have the HTTP poll task, which is a very familiar, very common construct in pretty much any service or application, right? Make a polling request, do it periodically. Again, interval, strategy are configurable, and then you can write some code to go ahead and determine when that is considered successful. These are just all examples of like the retry behavior, and it's all going to be for handling things within a specific workflow. Pretty commonly, though, you have exceptions, right? You have errors that you can't necessarily handle. You have errors that maybe can't be retried, or at least not within the retry period that you've defined. And in those cases, we have the ability to trigger out to external behavior, right? We can go ahead and say, when this workflow fails, do something else. Maybe it's call the alert workflow that's going to send a Slack notification, open a PagerDuty, or what have you. Maybe it's simply trigger a separate functionality, a separate retry behavior that is external to this workflow, that is maybe a little bit more complicated, maybe a little bit more involved, right? But it allows you to chain these behaviors together, whether it's exceptionally or just by choice, right? You can build that into this workflow as well. You can say, do one thing or another. You can trigger webhook calls. You can listen for webhook calls. Lots of behavior that you don't necessarily need to worry about writing code for can build directly into your workflow itself.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. So it's just, I don't want to say it's infinitely configurable, but there is so much flexibility in what you could do that it becomes extremely creative in how like you can connect to other systems.
Yeah, it's not quite Turing complete. We don't have a jump or a go-to, right? So within a workflow, you can't arbitrarily say go to this particular step in the execution. we have mechanisms for building similar things within bounds of best practices. Basically, you can use while loops to retry behavior, and those while loops can contain any number of tasks. But yeah, so it does end up being highly configurable, not infinitely configurable, not quite its own computer, but very close to it, right?
Right. That's cool. Awesome. Okay. That's number one. Work for the ability to do kind of the glue code, or reduce the need for you to, as a developer, to build your own glue code and tooling and things like that in the middle to connect stuff together and all that jazz. Cool. That's number one. All right, number two. And we talked about this a bit earlier, and I wanted to get into kind of the weeds. I mentioned Grafana or monitoring things, etc., which is a sort of a tangent into the concept of like incident response or incident handling. Which for some, depending on who you are, can mean a variety of different things. And in this context, what I'm specifically getting at is the ability for you to handle outages or incidents as they come up. And I don't mean, for anyone listening, I don't mean trying to recreate a incident management tool like a oh my gosh, my brain is like a ServiceNow or something like that. That's not what we're intending to do here. What I'm more thinking of is the ability to utilize features you've already kind of mentioned, like polling or webhooks and other things, to connect with various services for alerting, et cetera, to notify you if an exception happens or an incident, something occurs in the workflow, whether it's something simple as a task didn't run properly, or something more complex like we know for a fact that if this portion of the flow doesn't run the way it's supposed to, or fails, it's actually having this very critical issue. Maybe it's the part of the shopping cart app, or if you're on a Spotify type tool, that's a big component of search and it stopped working, so people can't actually search for something. Like, we know certain steps are highly critical to the user experience, and we want to be able to handle those sorts of incidents in a slightly different way than simply try this a couple of times and then let me know. It might be more complicated than that. And so I wanted to kind of bring up and kind of give you a chance to kind of show ways in which people can handle those sort of generally incidents, but also like any type of exception that might come up as well. Or I shouldn't say any type, but some types of exceptions.
Yeah. So some of the common ones, right? I think one thing you mentioned that I want to touch on really quickly is you mentioned webhooks, and webhooks are, bi-directional, right? You might use webhooks. You might listen to webhook events from other platforms, such as GitHub, if there's like a CI/CD issue, or such as one of your own ticketing systems. Zendesk can support, shipping out webhook notifications. So we can listen for webhooks in Conductor, and you can use those to start workflows, interact with workflows, etc. That's kind of the opposite of maybe what you're talking about right now, which is triggering webhooks in other platforms and other services. So, for example, Slack has their endpoints that you can call for sending notifications to a channel. That's oftentimes configured as a webhook on the Slack side, right? It gives you a URL that you can then make HTTP requests to, and you can use Conductor, you can use workflows to do just that. I think what I like to do when we talk about observing and observability and monitoring and showing this kind of behavior is I will very typically actually show one of the workflows that we run on a periodic basis in our like SaaS platform, right? Showing how we run these various parts of our application. You'll notice we have this workflow. We have a lot of workflows running. Many of these are health check workflows. These are what we run because we operate Conductor, right? We operate Conductor for a large number of our customers, and we need to make sure that these clusters are operating they're up to snuff, right? They're not having any issues. So we're going to go in, and this is going to be a little scary. If you've never looked at a workflow before, if you've never looked at a workflow in Conductor before, because it is a little bit larger than the basic workflow I was showing earlier. But essentially, I'll walk through it really quick and give you an idea of like what's going on here. So the first thing we do is we prepare the agent handler. That's not very important. Well, it is important, but you don't really need to know what it means other than it gets the cluster ready to be observed, right? We verify that our token is up to date. And then we have this fork task. And this is what I was alluding to earlier when I mentioned that Conductor or that orchestrators are very good at doing a lot of different things at the same time, right? Each of these tasks can happen independently of one another. We are checking the health of the various infrastructural components of this cluster. We're checking that the workers are up. We're checking that the pods themselves are healthy. There are multiple pods involved, so we have that task running actually multiple times with different inputs, right? we have the domains, DNS, conductor itself on the application level, right? We're checking the health of all these various components. And then we're doing some small validation here to ensure that it is in fact healthy. Publish metrics to Prometheus so that we can observe these visually in Grafana later, right? And then finally, we go ahead and check the API key and look at the health check statuses. So Jeff had mentioned, right, or you had mentioned, I guess, Jeff, had mentioned looking at doing alerts themselves and visualizing the case of how we got to various points in our workflows. At this point, this is where we're actually looking at the output of those health checks previously and seeing, is there an issue, right? I won't go into what this switch case actually does. It's evaluating the outputs of each of those previous tasks. Switch cases can use JavaScript in them. So in this case, there is a JavaScript snippet that is just evaluating if there's a health check issue. In this case, there wasn't. Great, the cluster's healthy. But if there were an issue, we would then evaluate the cluster itself. We would say, hey, is this a test cluster or a production cluster? If it is a test cluster, we notify one particular Slack channel because it's a lower priority. But if it is a production cluster, we look at the priority of the issue itself, if it is critical or not, and we ping a particular Slack channel and potentially notify on PagerDuty appropriately, right? And you can visualize the flow of all this logic, the decision flow that needs to happen when you're running in this application. And this kind of process, in this case, we're doing it within this workflow itself, right? This is one big workflow. What's very common when we're talking or when we're looking at building these workflows out is actually separating that out into a separate workflow and either calling it directly or having it trigger on a failure, right? And this kind of flexibility is very common when we're talking about like monitoring observability within Conductor.
Again, I'm muted. Something you called out there. I'm gonna make sure not to do that again, like last time, where I talked for like minutes. You're like, Jeff, you're muted. You called out there, but there's a few things I wanted to touch on. But one that you specifically mentioned was the ability to, or you mentioned briefly, like PagerDuty in addition to Slack. So like you could, as you mentioned, you could. I'm assuming you could pretty easily connect to like an Opsgenie or a PagerDuty, what have you, to let those things handle. If you have escalation processes and things like those already built out in PagerDuty or Opsgenie, because those platforms will allow you to do all that. You don't have to you don't have to sit back and say, well, how do I build a whole workflow to handle all my escalations? Like, I'm assuming you could do that if you wanted to, but coming back to that first topic about glue code, this isn't exactly the same, but basically saying you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. You can use a platform like a PagerDuty or an Opsgenie that does those sorts of things really well, and basically invoke that service, so to speak, invoke that service to handle those things for you if you choose to.
Exactly, yeah. And I realized I'm maybe not zoomed in enough for this to be evident on the stream, but these tasks are calling Slack directly for doing the notification of our engineers. And then this task next up is doing exactly that, right? It's calling to PagerDuty. It's using that external service because they do case management better than we likely could, at least as a product offering. And so we use that today under the hood, right? At least for our own internal processes.
Yeah, I mean, that makes tons of sense. It's, not that anybody who's listening is like, hey, why couldn't you just build that in? We probably could. It's one of the things we could, and I don't want to speak for our product teams, et cetera, but there's also a time and a place to decide, is that the right thing to do for what we offer, or does it make more sense to partner with companies like those or platforms like those? Honestly, I think in a lot of cases it makes more sense to partner because we don't need to be the expert in that. We can just say, look, that's what you're already going to probably use those platforms for a variety of other things that you do at your company. Why don't we just leverage your implementation, send over that stuff, and let that stuff handle it? And then, yeah, the idea of like also sending messages directly into Slack, I think, is also really helpful too, because not that you don't want to leverage some sort of escalation process, and I'm using the word escalation here to mean something probably a little different than non-developers would think about it, but really just the elevation process of like, trigger this alert, and if something doesn't happen for a period of time, then elevate it to the next alert using the term escalation, elevate it to the next tier, elevate to the next tier, et cetera. But handling it where you have a smaller team or what have you that can monitor a Slack channel and just sending a message in there saying, hey, go do something with this information right away I think is really useful. But yes, I think you hit what I was getting at more than anything else. Probably should have come up with a different way to say the incident detection and response, but the idea of being able to get notifications or handle situations that come up in various ways, whether it's notifying Slack, PagerDuty, what have you. I think that's really useful to know because you can, like you said, you can build that directly into the workflow or have some number of separate sub workflows or separate workflows that can be then called or triggered to then handle those things for you.
Yeah, and I guess I realize I should have shown this very simple example prior to this, a very neat way of illustrating what I was getting at with the like failure workflow behavior. As you might have noticed, I just changed this URL here to something that will definitely not resolve, and thus this API call will fail, right? I'm going to change this workflow so that when this workflow fails, it triggers our alert workflow, which in the case of this cluster isn't actually going to do anything, but it'll let you see what that mechanism would look like, right? So we'll run this. The error fails. We'll notice it triggers a failure workflow, and then this failure workflow can do whatever you want. In this case, I am making a dummy API call, but this could very easily be that Slack or PagerDuty as well, right?
Yeah, that makes total sense. That makes complete sense. And you mentioned having a separate workflow that's like your alert workflow that you just build out that just repeats those steps in a certain set of ways. And I can imagine then you could have a variety of different workflows that are handling different types of alerting that can be invoked in various ways, et cetera. So you can get highly creative probably with all of that. Cool. Right on. Okay, moving on. The next one I had listed here is the idea of integrating various tools and systems. So integrations, et cetera. In Orkes Conductor, like on the surface level, it's already really powerful. But I think it'd be really cool to talk about how third-party tools or external tools that are external to Orkes or Orkes Conductor can be integrated, and how we've made that simple in some ways. But then, generally speaking, how Conductor does make that build out and that handling a little bit easier. So things like you mentioned already, connecting to third-party APIs. We've kind of already seen some example of how that's easier. But like databases, AI integrations, all kinds of different things. So I figured it'd be a good time to kind of just show not just the pre-built sort of we've made some of this easy for you already, but also the how can you make that stuff easy yourself by simply just building your workflow.
Yeah. So when I think about integrations with Conductor, right, there are, like you mentioned, the infrastructure and external service level integrations, things like Postgres, things like those AI, ML, or if you need like a graph database, right, like those could be potentially easier to integrate with Conductor in like a one-click fashion. I think what I like to talk about a lot is integrating between services cross teams, cross functionally, right? So when we look at potentially, maybe you want to access a Postgres database, but you don't even necessarily care about the Postgres database itself. You care about the information that's in it. And if that database is owned by a separate team, maybe they've done that connection for you. And so when we talk about integrating with various tools and systems that are out there, I will very commonly point people towards not just the integrations plane, which is where you can do all of those, right, infrastructural level connections. And a lot of these are going to be Orkes specific, but I'll just scroll through it really quickly, right? Message brokers, relational databases, that kind of thing. But then we go down to the access control section as well. And here you can go ahead and define users and groups. These might be teams, these might be organizations that have ownership over particular tasks, particular workflows. And you can actually then use workflows as a way to encapsulate those external integrations, to encapsulate those external connections, right? So things like, yes, there is a Postgres database under the hood, but the person on the order management team might not necessarily care about the database underlying the functionality. They just care about there being some way for them to get the data. So maybe whoever owns the Postgres database itself has a workflow defined that the other team members can then invoke as a part of their own workflows, right? Does that make sense, Jeff?
It does. Yes, it absolutely does. Do you have any examples of that you could show, or a couple of those you could show, like in specific?
Yeah, I guess I don't have any showing like a specific Postgres connection. I'll show two things here. Firstly, if you had a Postgres connection configured within your Orkes Conductor cluster, you would be able to go ahead and make a JDBC call. This is going to let you choose. I guess I do have a dummy one. I'm almost certain this does not connect to an actual database, but you can go ahead and select the integration and then write your SQL query. This can use, we haven't really shown it on this call or on this stream today, but this can use our syntax we have for referencing other parts of a workflow, right? So here you can go ahead and actually do, right, if you wanted to refer to workflow inputs, like some input, you could use that within the bounds of the SQL query as well. But this is a SQL query, right? You can query a database, fairly straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Additionally, you have the concept of the sub workflow. This is kind of what I was referring to earlier when it comes to using a workflow that might be owned by a different team, or depending on the size of your organization, different team member, right? So if we go ahead, we can say call. Well, in this case, I'm going to use the alert workflow because we already know what that looks like. But potentially that could be a workflow that just contains a SQL call or contains a chain of SQL calls that need to be orchestrated on their own, right? And just showing you, you can expand this, you can see what's going on under the hood potentially. But then if this workflow had a particular input, yep, there you go. So this workflow calls out to do some AI LLM work, right? And it takes in 3 different inputs, and you'll notice these were populated here for me. So in the case of a service team that owns a database, they might have these input parameters already available so that the downstream teams know what is expected to make the calls to that database. And then the team that actually owns the database uses them in the appropriate way within the SQL query. And whoever's using that information, using the data, doesn't have to worry about the semantics of the database itself.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Cool. That's super helpful. And I know you showed the screen where we have a lot of pre-built integrations, and just for anyone watching now or catching this on Team Replay, just know if there are other integrations you're interested in or that you would find really useful, we're always open to hearing what those are so we can go look into potentially doing that. We always have probably a running list of those we're trying to prioritize to get done. But if you have some, please just drop it in the comments here in the video. Or if you're in Conductor Slack, I recommend you join it. But if you're in Conductor Slack, go ahead and message us there and let us know that there's an integration you're looking for. But separate from that, yeah, the ability to just kind of build out the integrations you need pretty easily and then visually see how those are set up, where they're calling to, et cetera, I think is really useful. All right, let's move on to number 4 here because we're already past the halfway point. We've got so much to talk about, which is cool. Okay, this is one I threw in there, and it may be throwing a curveball. I don't know. We'll see. But the idea of this is an acronym that is floating out there in the world. People probably have heard it in some way. The idea of BPMN, or Business Process Modeling and Notation. I'll just say Business Process Modeling. So at a high level, the idea behind this concept is that business operators, those who actually run the operations of a business and decide how do processes work in the company. And when I'm saying this, it sounds very abstract, but I literally do mean things like order comes in, who does it go to, what happens then, how does that flow happen until the thing is completed and there's a conclusion, supply chain processes, accounting, all these different types of business processes that have to be modeled out and show that they flow in a certain way. There have been products out there over the years that allow you to do that, like actually build out your modeling. And there have been some offerings, I believe, that float around that also in some way connect to or help instigate a application workflow maybe, or an application maybe doing some behavior. But what I thought might be interesting to show here is really how synonymous a application workflow is in Conductor with what a business process might actually look like. Because when I look at some of these visuals and some of the apps you've already shown, it's very easy to look at them and say, well, if I look at the naming on here, a business operator might look and go, I don't really know what this means. But when you actually go through and step by step look at it, you're literally showing, and I think it'd be great for you to go through this, you're literally showing this is a business process. This is a step in that application, or you're running through a flow in that application that's actively completing a business process for the company that concludes in either a sale or a product operation or something other step. And so I thought it might be kind of interesting to talk a bit about how there's an overlap between the idea of business process modeling and some of the other tools that might be out there, and how that actually looks in a product like Conductor.
Yeah. I guess, Jeff, let me turn this around to you really quick, because I think this goes very hand in hand with our 5th and final question as well, as far as the people who are building these business processes typically are not the most developer-oriented person. So are you fine with me maybe colliding these worlds a little bit?
Please do, because something in that last one as well, and like in the conversations that we have, like one of my favorite, as I was researching more and more about the idea of business process modeling, I'm not a business operator, I never have been, but that's not my forte. But when I think about that more and more, one of the things I've always experienced working in technology, and then specifically working in things like networking, which has we have the same sort of conversational or topical challenge in that world, when I was a network admin, network architect, et cetera, as I would say is synonymous in some ways to how developers feel, which is we each talk kind of our own language when it comes to how we communicate what's happening. They're at different layers of the OSI model, but we're still talking, we're still kind of using our own things to describe how data is moving, what's happening with it, et cetera. And when you talk to a person who is not in that world, who might be a business operator or somebody like an accountant or what have you, and you mention anything around these lanes, they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like it doesn't, and it's not a lack of anything other than the nomenclature. That's not the language they use when they're communicating. And one of the things I found really interesting is if we can find a way to overlap more and more of the idea of a business process being visually represented and being someone to look at and see in relation to the app that is running, that it's orchestrating or that it's running for them, could really help break down a lot of barriers between these different groups. Because someone who could say, well, I don't think about it the way that you do, Haven, when I called you as a dev, but I know that the app is supposed to do these things. And you're like, yeah, let me show you right here. You can see your business flow. Each of those steps almost directly correlates with something that's happening in the application. And I think that could actually end up helping people talk a little bit or communicate a little bit more effectively to each other. And so, yeah, I wanted to bring these last two topics. That the final one is kind of about the idea of simplifying the workflow creation, both for developers and people who are just becoming like younger developers. And by younger, I don't mean young in age necessarily. I mean young in their career as a developer, learning how to do this stuff. So I thought it'd be really interesting to kind of wax poetic a little bit about like what this could mean and how it could actually turn into a benefit in the industry overall.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think one thing you mentioned that I want to kind of pick on is you mentioned like looking at things and visualizing the process in such a way that you were referring to, or at least it sounded like you were referring to, like after the fact, once things are running, this is what's running, this is where it's running, this is why it's running, right? That's definitely part of this conversation. Huge benefit of using an orchestrator with like a common language, a common vocabulary between different people. But also even prior to that, even before the real like development work happens, the people who are typically involved in these business process modeling tools, who are building out, right, we go to the cart service and then the order service, or you add item to cart and then you make sure we have it in the warehouse, right? And you go through that process. I don't need to be an engineer to define the business process there. And so sometimes we have customers, we have people who come in and they hand this tool to their non-engineering folks and say, hey, go ahead and translate what you're doing today into Orkes. And they come through very simply and they go ahead and click through. And none of this is going to do anything yet because there's no code under the hood, but you don't need to know how to write code to say, right, check warehouse and put that in this task definition. And now, yes, somewhere down the line, there will be an engineer involved who needs to write the check warehouse service, and very likely there will be databases involved. There will be calls to external services to make sure that if you don't have it in the warehouse, you can order it in time to fulfill the order, right? But the check warehouse task itself, as far as the business user is concerned, is going to be very discrete. They don't necessarily need to know what's going on under the hood. They can then check the warehouse. They can go ahead. Well, if we make a new worker task, right? I guess I chose the wrong one, but you get the idea. Add item to cart, right? And they can build this out even to the point of doing like decision cases where they can say, is there inventory, right? And we can say, yes, there is, or there is not inventory. And this can be something the business user writes, right? This can be something that the non-technical user, or to your point, Jeff, the newer member of the team builds out to translate the requirements of the service into a little bit more of a formalized process. And then maybe it's the newer engineer, maybe it's somebody who has experience writing these services already or knows where everything lives already that comes in and helps flesh this out, right? Either way, you're able to share this vocabulary up front for what the business process is going to look like. There is a bit of a... Sorry, yeah, you look like you are...
Oh,
question.
You paused for a sec, so I just wanted to throw out that the idea of giving a business operator, and I apologize for everyone, anybody watching this. When I'm saying the term business operator, I specifically do mean people who are like actively thinking about how to build out the business processes that need to happen for an organization to run properly. But then I also do mean, or I could be alluding to people who are the actual people doing the work every day. Somebody who is in supply chain, somebody who is processing orders as they come through, somebody who is part of the business process in so much that they run the day to day. They actually are the person handling the things that the business process like identifies. Like here, if you have a design, like big Visio or something on the wall, and someone's like, how orders get fulfilled, and it looks like this. The person who's actually doing all those steps, they may not look at that visual, but they're like, yeah, that's the job that I do every day. I'm oversimplifying, of course. So I'm kind of looping a lot of different people into that term business operator. I recognize there's a billion ways to be nuanced about that, so I apologize in advance to anybody who does any of that type of work. I'm not meaning to oversimplify all of you, but I think for the sake of this conversation, I wanted to like group that together because what you just visually represented on the screen would help, I believe, make a lot of those conversations a lot easier. But then to your point, you could give a person access to say, will you go map out your process for me? You don't need to do anything else other than what you just did, Haven, and like lay these things out visually. Then when you sit down and have a conversation with a developer or the developer team or the architect, whoever it is in your company that you need to talk with, you can explain to them, not just here's all the steps that have to happen, but you do it in a similar place that they're going to actually go ahead. Yo.
Yeah, I was going to say that's super important. What's really cool, I think, is the flip side, though, right? So whoever defines the business process, your business operator, they're going to come in, they're going to build this workflow, and it won't work yet. And very likely the engineer who actually implements the individual tasks, it's possible they rewrite the workflow using their programming language, because a lot of people like workflows as code, in which case it's not going to actually be stemming from the same workflow the business process user originally created. But then at execution time, at runtime, you have the shared vocabulary still. The business process user knows what to expect from this kind of diagram. So when they go to maybe something that's a little bit scarier, that's being run at the time at which, right, the workflow is being executed, the cart is actually being updated, they can see it and they can understand it and they can digest it, right? Even if the workflow itself ends up going through 8 translation steps and then now it's in Python, the operator doesn't need to know that the workflow is in Python or that the tasks are in Python, right? They just have the view of a single pane of glass, right, of what's going on in that business process.
Oh, dude, that is such a good point. And actually, coming back to this workflow, this example workflow you have up, with especially that one step right there that has like all these other things that are involved, or that happen simultaneously, and then having the green check boxes. I know it seems it always for some of us who have been like deep in the engineering weeds for a long time. Sometimes the visual and the little check boxes are kind of like sometimes we try to fight it ourselves. I'm like, oh God, come on, do you really need that? Like you just know, but no. The reality is most human beings do not think that way. They're visual. They look at something and giving them a way to very quickly look at a diagram and go, yes, I know what's supposed to happen. That's not a green checkbox. That means something is wrong. Let me zoom in and go look at this. And to your point, having that common language and common way to visually represent those things on a screen, that two people with two seemingly different ways of even thinking about their work can look at and both go, oh, no, I understand what this is telling me. So when they get in that old classic style of like war room or, everyone get on a call. I'm sorry, I'm dating myself a lot. Like the war room in the conference room where the dialer and everyone gets dialed.
They still happen.
God. I remember that we used to have like an on-call. Sorry, this is a tangent. We used to have this on-call list at one of the first big company I worked for. I won't say the name, but it was a very large motorcycle company. And I remember we used to have a standing piece of paper on a couple different walls that was like, this is the war room dialer. So if it happens, everyone just dial into this bridge. Sorry for anybody watching. We dial into a bridge if anybody knows what that still means. Dial into the bridge so you can listen in, and here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to talk about it. But I joke. Coming back to the image, though, it's really useful for everyone to go, that step whatever it is, didn't happen, or we're seeing a chain of like failures at that point, or in many cases and much more often, I don't see a long chain of failures where one thing stopped here, okay, clearly fix that, everything else is fine. But like I see a couple failures in the middle of, in this case, a workflow. Other stuff is still functioning. Why aren't these two happening, and what problems is that causing? So then you get an operator look at it who's like, wait a second, that step right there, I know actually triggers these other steps that have to happen either on the front end for a customer if it's a product thing, but it could be a supply chain thing where it's actually something that has to instigate for a third party. If you're financial services, like I worked at a chartered bank and I worked at a credit union, and there is a ton of back-end processes that have to connect to the Fed for transferring things like that, connecting to federal agencies for checking for known watch lists and other types of, there's all these nuanced behaviors that happen on the back end, but if they don't happen properly, the front end applications, money transfers can still kind of happen and they still function, or they might pause. But if this back end thing doesn't work, some downstream effects will occur for you and errors have to be handled. Like, so you might see an error occur someplace, but the flow overall is still working because it's intended to do so. So having somebody who understands what the business is actually doing and what should happen next to be able to look at it and go, I know what's occurring here. So when Haven or another engineer jumps in and says, well, I know that this technically is wrong, the operator can say yes. And at that point, here's the criticality of it. The business critical nature of that is at this severity level or this because of these other things that are happening. Oh, okay. Now I actually have a real understanding of what that is when we're going to troubleshoot. But I think that is so useful. And I don't think that personally, I don't think that sort of that component of these sorts of platforms, specifically of Conductor, probably like when I'm in conversation with people, it doesn't often get talked about as much as I think it probably should be.
Yeah, I think when we look at that kind of situation where it's like identifying those failure points, you mentioned the little green check marks, right? I Little green check marks are fine. I love the little red X's or cancel symbols showing you where something fails,
100%.
because identifying those failure points is something that's really tough, and getting a little bit away in the opposite direction of like the business process conversation, it's really tough in distributed systems, right? In very large scale applications. That's what Conductor was made for initially. It's made for highly technical engineering teams to build out distributed systems in a way that reduces glue code. And so being able to very easily identify, in this case, this is a small, simple workflow. There's not a whole lot that could go wrong. But in a larger workflow, like the health check one, being able to identify which of the health checks failed, right? And seeing that in just one place, it's a huge benefit.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Actually, as you were saying that, you mentioned you like the little red circles with the like warning on it.
Yeah.
And I have two things I thought about. One that is real, and one that is more of just me, my silly brain, remembering back in the day of early LAN parties and playing Half-Life, and an error goes off the brr, brr sound. I'm like, nobody needs that. Anyway, sorry, my nerd brain from like the early 2000s coming back. Something actually happened. I won't give too many of the details, but something happened internally for us at Orkes where I think this was yesterday in a thread that was going on about, updates or what have you in the UI, just normal business operation stuff, prepping releases and things like that. And you actually mentioned at one particular screen that there was a message that popped up at the top of the screen that actually did tell you about a successful completion of something, but it was colored like you have at the top of the screen there. It was colored in that sort of like pale pink. And I don't remember if it had the little exclamation point, like bang dot that's like in red,
Yep.
but it like has the string. But if you read the string, it actually said, yeah, it actually worked. But for some reason, the coloring was just off, had not been changed to something that was more positive or successful completion, etc. And I really appreciate that you touched on that or the idea of that, because as humans, we're very visual, we're very social. Our brains trigger off of visual cues in a lot of ways, which is why even jokingly back in the day, we would have dashboards up on the screen for like the executives or whoever to walk by and see, red, green, yellow stoplights, because it was just really, they like, I don't need to know any more than is it good or is it bad? Then let's have a conversation. And so having a visual at the top of a screen that isn't the green or a blue, but is more of a red or an amber or what have you, is going to tell someone, wait, that's something wrong. And if you, unfortunately, and you've probably experienced this, if you have, I don't want to say the wrong person, but somebody who has a different way of viewing things. I've had this happen where someone walks in a room and the message at the screen, top of the screen isn't in green or in blue or there's calmer tones that we think of, and they see it in a different color. They're like, no, but if it's orange or red, that means bad. I don't care what you tell me. You need to go investigate. Well, it says right here everything's fine. No, but red means bad. No one would have put that there unless they meant that. And then you could end up spinning this long rabbit trail of like things to find out that what you brought up yesterday internally, somebody just left the wrong color code someplace and it's nothing more than that. It could save you so much time though.
Especially when we're talking about integrating between technical and non-technical teams, right? Like when we go back to this, and this is an example of like, it's an actual error, right? Like this is a failure. You are correctly identifying this as a failure by the red banner. But if it were somebody who's technical, and if this were a message that was also technical, and even if the process completed successfully and it was red, the business user might not know what this is saying, right? So it's very important to play on those cues. That's something constantly being developed, constantly being worked on, right? But it is an example of like when we're building out these workflows, it's very important to have not just the alerting side, but also like the proper workflow construction. And so it's always very fun to like talk to people and work with them to build out their workflows so that they look a little bit nicer and can behave as you expect them to, right?
Yeah. It's you're smirking a little bit when you say that, and because there are plenty of cases where that's 100% true, and there's some cases where even the person building like, maybe we're being a little excessive about this, but. And I'm being flip when I say that part, but the reality is, I think what you just said is so important, because back to that kind of common language idea in business process modeling, and just in general when you're building documentation, workflows, etc. If somebody looks at this and it's supposed to relate to what they do, and they don't clearly understand it when they first look at it, that to me is a problem. Because if we want to get closer to a place where something like Conductor can help both your business operators as well as your engineers, etc., visually see something and then get to the root cause or whatever it needs to be, a change in the decision, a optimization of a part of a process, etc., the closer you can get to, hey, this visually represents what we're actually doing and what we actually run every day, then the engineers have a much better idea of like, okay, this is what should be happening. We might actually be misunderstanding something in how it operates, but also vice versa. We could say, hey, your business process does these 4 things. We could make that all a lot easier for you in code, but we can see that in the workflow, this is like, we think of things in system design. This is not an optimal way to do this. And so it creates this way of like, almost like these opportunities for collaboration back and forth to figure out where things can be optimized, where they can be troubleshot, etc. And it gives people who are not engineers and engineers a much easier way to look at something and go, wait, hold on. Is that actually accurate? Because I see you have a step here or what have you that I don't think is necessary. The person goes, oh no, we have to do that for this reason. I'll give you a simple example of this. I don't know that this would have helped where this came about years ago for me. I was running a help desk, and I remember we kept having a person talking to us like, we're doing this process and it's not working, and every time we try it, it doesn't function, etc. And I'm not going into the details because it's too complex to talk about the politics behind it internally. But the simple version of it was it was a loan origination group that was their process involved putting information into a massive spreadsheet. And when I say massive, I mean we're talking this is probably 2004, and it was probably like in the 500 to 600 meg range for a spreadsheet. And I'm like, this thing was so obnoxiously large that it was crashing. It was actually crashing and automated. Somebody had written some code or some scripting to automate the process of taking data dumps and dropping it into Excel. The history had been that they didn't know how to talk to our DBAs at some point to actually go have a database built out. So they just did it themselves. And over many years, it was dumping data automatically into a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet was crashing. It wouldn't open or it'd get corrupted. And they're like, our business process isn't functioning. And it took more time than I want to admit to finally ask the right questions to figure out there's a spreadsheet someplace on a shared drive in a Windows server that nobody in IT had any idea about. We didn't know it existed because it wasn't a discussed thing. It was just what they did. And once we finally got in, we're like, yeah, we can keep recovering this thing for you, but it's corrupted because this is not where data should be. And it turned into a whole thing before we convinced them to move it to an actual database. But if we had had something like this that clearly showed this is their process and what they go through, engineers could look at it and say, wait, what is this step right here? We don't understand what that is. It's not code. It's not an application. So we probably could have gotten to that conversation. We still would have had struggle to like bring it to a database, change your process. That's a whole thing anyway. But we could have gotten there a lot quicker. It took weeks, easily weeks, to figure out that this is what was actually happening, or that rather their request for recovering a corrupted Excel spreadsheet and this problem were actually the same thing, but we had no idea. And so it took weeks to figure out that, oh, we're talking about the exact same thing here. But I see a visual like this and I'm like, this type of implementation would help so much in minimizing that type of problem.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool, dude. Well, listen, we are almost out of time. I cannot believe an hour just like flew by. Like for five things that we were talking about, an hour just flew by. So this has been super cool, dude. I sincerely appreciate you being back here to kind of walk through this. We will do it again. And the last time you and I did one of these streams and we dropped afterwards, we talked a bit about like doing something a little bit more fun and interesting. I mean, this is cool. Don't get me wrong. This is cool. I'm like that dad trying to tell you that I am cool. No, this is fun and we have a good time with it. But Haven had this really cool idea for everyone watching about doing something to more like maybe co-development or some other thing like that where we're not just demoing, we're actually like seeing some live stuff happening. So I have that in the works to plan out for either February or March to do another stream or set of streams where we do something like that. So if you have feedback, anything, hit me up on all the socials, jump into the Conductor Slack and let me know. And we're going to get that developed out here very soon. But so we can wrap. Haven, dude, thank you so much for being here. Sincerely appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, dude. I'm going to say goodbye to Haven, and I'm going to switch back over to myself here real quick. Just to do a quick outro for everyone. I would have shown you Sunny Cam again as a wrap up, but Sunny has left the room. He heard his sister out of the door, and he decided to bounce. So just as a wrap up, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel. We're putting out a lot of new content, new shorts coming out. We've got a lot of new videos related to technical blogs and other AI related things. So there's a lot of really good stuff. And I mentioned this earlier on. If you want to use Conductor open source, you can just simply go to the GitHub repo or go to conductor-oss.org. Download the Conductor open source version, join that community. If you want to play with Orkes Conductor, the enterprise version that we offer, right here on the screen, it's actually on my left, your right, my left, here on the screen, I've got a QR code you can scan. That will take you directly to the Orkes Developer Playground. You can also go to orkes.io, and you'll click on the try for free button. Takes you into the developer edition, which has your own namespace. It's your own sandbox. You can play with Orkes Conductor all you want. It's really, really cool. Knowing that, I just want to say thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day, and we will see you on the next stream soon.